Elizabeth Connors. Just a few reminders, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our website once it has been closed captioned. We'll be using the chat box today for any questions that you have, and we'll also be having some discussion time, and you can feel free to unmute yourself to join the discussion during that time. So Dr. Elizabeth Connors is an assistant professor at the Consultation Center at Yale. She received her PhD in clinical child and community psychology from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and is a licensed clinical psychologist. So her research program focuses on improving the quality of mental health promotion, prevention, and intervention services for children, adolescents, and their families in critical access points such as schools and primary care settings. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to Dr. Connors.
Great, thank you so much, Liz. I just stopped sharing my screen for a quick moment because I needed to turn up my volume so I can hear you all. But it's wonderful to be here with you, and please do join me on screen, on camera, if you're comfortable to do so. I love to sort of see everybody's faces as we're doing this. So I just want to check that you can see my large slide. Is that right? Yes? Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So it's such a pleasure to be here with you and to be asked to just kind of share a little bit of information about how we can really stay very data-driven in our approach to supporting student mental health. I know all of you are just rapidly planning for the return of school and for our students to come back, and that looks very different in a lot of different locales, probably even across Wisconsin as much as it does across the country. And so you're managing a large number of logistics. And so for this talk, I wanted to really center us on the student mental health portion of the planning for reopening, and also for thinking about this upcoming school year, with a specific focus on how we can ensure that we are collecting really real-time, actionable data to inform the planning and kind of ongoing continuous quality improvement that we'll be doing this year in schools. So the first part of the talk is grounding us in what to expect in terms of the COVID-19 impacts on student mental health. There are some things that we actually know from the literature prior to COVID-19 that can point us in some correct directions about what to expect and anticipate. And then I want to go through 4 data collection options that you may wish to use to assess the impacts of student mental health locally for your particular area. And then the second portion of the talk is really talking about how you can build out a multi-tiered system of support and enhance your multi-tiered system of support based on the data that you are collecting, right? And so I'll share just some general information and tools as we think about our multi-tiered system of support going into this very unique school year. So first, you know, I think all of us can have a shared experience of a little bit of anxiety and uncertainty around school reopening and what to expect from our students and families and their needs when they come back to school. But there actually are a number of things that we already know about our students and how they respond to stress, and kind of the impact of economic and other, you know, wide-scale stressors on communities. So we can actually rely on some good data at our disposal already to give us some clues and point us in the right direction so that we don't feel like we're going into this school year with no information. Certainly this pandemic is new and it's unprecedented, but there's so much that we know about high-quality school mental health and how our students and families and school teams respond to stress in many ways. If you guys, you know, hear only a few things from me today, one of the things I want you to take home with is you've got this. I think you have, you know, a lot of expertise in this area, and schools are always having to kind of stay on their toes and respond to student, family, and community needs that crop up sometimes unexpected, right? So we're used to having to be nimble and responsive and kind of blend that with our forethought and our planning. And in many cases, there's a lot of similarities with this situation. So let's start with some things that we know we can anticipate. So first of all, as I think all of you probably on the call know, there's such strong school mental health in Wisconsin. Schools really are a primary mental health provider for children, adolescents, for the small number of children, adolescents who receive mental health services that need it, particularly at that tier 2 and tier 3 level. They are receiving it from somebody working in a school building, whether that's a related services provider or a community mental health provider that's operating on campus. So what happens when we've had all these school closures is that our access to health and mental health services have been reduced and have been disrupted. And you all felt that at the end of school year, where everything last school year had to go virtual very quickly. So we know that there's been a reduced and disrupted access to mental health services and health services in some regards. If you have school-based health centers or other health services that your school nurses provide. We also know that this reduced access to school mental health is going to disproportionately affect some subpopulations of our student body. So our students and families in racial and ethnic minority groups with lower family income and or public insurance, just to name a few, anybody in those subgroup categories may be more likely to experience this reduced access. And why is that? Because those subpopulations are more likely to access school-based mental health services, right? So there really is a disproportionality that is happening with our school closures and distance learning. We also know from the literature that prior economic downturns in this country really do affect youth mental health, and that's because of the stress and unemployment that the adults in the child's life are experiencing. So we know that schools also offer critical services like nutrition and linking to community-based resources, not just mental health, but think about it, all of it, housing, food pantries, sometimes employment linkages. Schools really are kind of the center hub in many ways to a lot of community-based services for families. So we know that access to our health and mental health services is disrupted when schools are closed, and we know that linkages to nutrition and some of these other critical services have been disrupted. Now, there hasn't been very much data that's collected and reported so far on COVID-specific impacts on student mental health. There's a lot of data collection and research that's underway right now, and certainly will be likely to continue in the fall. But I was able to find this very informative large-scale survey that was done in England right around the time of the beginning of the COVID closures, the shutdown in early March. And they surveyed, I believe, 2,000 young people, so teenagers all the way up into young adults, to ask them about how these closures have really impacted their mental health. The report is linked on the bottom of the slide. I think it's really accessible, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Here's some highlights that I pulled out. So 26% of the students who had received mental health services prior to the shutdown were not able to continue to receive those services. So although that's disheartening, it means that 75% of students were able to continue in a virtual format, okay? Also, many of those received support from a school or university counselor. Again, even with the disruptions happening and things going virtual, students were still able to receive mental health services from school. For students, mental health problems primarily became worse for them during this time. And just some of the concerns they noted were just concerns about their family's health and well-being, school closures creating uncertainty, loss of contact with friends, and just a whole variety of different stressors, as well as kind of this generalized type of stress and anxiety, loss of routine, certainly, and a loss of social connection. Importantly, I think we need to be paying attention to any data that comes out that tells us what's most helpful to students and families, because that's where I think that schools have an opportunity to lean in. The face-to-face calls with friends was rated the most helpful for coping. And again, I think that peer-to-peer support and being able to interact and have that video component is something that was actually the highest rated coping skill. So you can check out this report if there are other coping skills that you want to look at that were reported by this sample. So I just want to pause because I have a couple more slides on what we know about COVID as a traumatic stressor. But before we move on to that, I'm just curious, what other mental health related impacts are you all anticipating your students returning with? I know I haven't touched on all of them, so you're welcome to unmute or type in the chat box and share your thoughts on that.
Hi, Elizabeth. I fear that my students will be scared to come back to school because of, as noted right here, separation anxiety, and also because of what they've been hearing from parents, the news. I don't want to get infected and things of that nature of them actually returning back to school. Right now they are in their safe place at home, and I worry about them leaving their safe place and how they'll feel about that.
Thank you for sharing that. Other concerns that folks have about what students will be feeling or experiencing when they come back to school?
There are some things, Elizabeth, in the chat.
Oh, thank you. You know, I have this thing, I feel that I'm fairly Zoom savvy, but when I'm sharing my slides, I'm not able to view the chat. Would someone mind reading
Yeah.
those out to me?
That's why we're here.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read some for you, Elizabeth. This is Tim Pierenboom from DPI. Anxiety, sensing from family that the school's not safe, lack of capacity and agency to sustain in a learning environment, grief and loss, trauma of having spent months at home with an abuser, looking forward to socializing, not able to do it in the way that they think they will, stressors in the community, racism, political uncertainty, economic stress, anxiety coming back into a different environment that school will not look the same as it did before.
Thank you. Wow, that was quite a list. See, you guys really do know what to expect. And I do think that you're quite well prepared for this, just having a sense of what your students are going through. I think, you know, many of the things that were read actually tie back to the first comment, which is that all of us have had to kind of go into this place of being very protective of our personal spaces and kind of hunkering down during this quarantine. And so it feels a little bit scary to come out of that, right? And just start going out and about and seeing people. And in some cases, we've had to explain to our children why we're at home, which is to stay safe and to stay healthy. And now we're telling them all of a sudden it's okay to go back to school, but they're going to need some additional reassurance and support as we all transition to feeling that we can do that with safe measures and precautions, and do that in a way that feels safe and healthy. So, you know, kids take their cues from us as adults, whether it's parents or teachers, and also I'll be talking a little bit more about some other things that we can do with regard to student mental health. I know there are, you know, widespread concern shared across the country with regard to the child maltreatment concern, and, you know, children being at risk at home with different things going on in the home environment. While I think that's certainly true, whenever I hear that, I also like to share just an opposite viewpoint that I was exposed to recently, actually working with public defenders in the Bronx, who work with a lot of families who are involved in social services. And, you know, at least with the families that they work with, they were saying that, you know, they're very aware that there's a concern that there may be increasing sort of risk of abuse in their household. And at times that may keep them from sharing with their social workers or other support systems how stressed they are, just for fear that, you know, their children are going to be taken away, et cetera. So I think we need to kind of hold those concerns in mind, certainly about child safety and support, and at the same time make sure that we're supporting our most vulnerable families and making it okay for families to let us know when they're experiencing stress and to sort of reach out for support. It's a very delicate balance. But thank you for sharing all of those concerns, and I agree with them all.
Elizabeth, there's a couple more that came in as you're talking that I think maybe are important to touch on. No closure with last year's teachers, presumably due to you know, the abrupt ending of the school year. Related to that, anxiety related to missed transition activities, such as from 5th grade to middle school or transitioning to the high school. And then the lack of communication, having language deprivation in the deaf, hard of hearing population.
Yes, absolutely. You know, all of our students and our teachers and the whole school community missed out on so many milestones and things last year. And I think we're concerned that everybody's going to be behind sort of academically and have missed a lot of social milestones. And we know that our students with disabilities are in a very vulnerable subpopulation, and we need to be making sure that we are staying very closely connected to understanding what their needs are specifically and taking some additional measures to make sure that they're not left behind and don't continue to be disproportionately affected by this. Thank you. And there, of course, you know, as the end of the school year wrapped up and then the summer ensued, another thing that was mentioned in the chat that you read out that I haven't spoken to yet is just the, you know, again, another surge of racial injustices and violence throughout our country, and the continued impact that that has on all of us, particularly our students and families of color in our school systems. And as we continue to kind of think about the school's role in institutional injustices and racism, I mean, that's on top of mind for everybody. So it's really an additional layer. Of course, this is a longstanding issue that's been happening in our country that schools have been working with, but with increasing concerns about this recently, it's certainly another layer to be keeping in the forefront as schools are reopening. So that's another factor that we certainly don't want to ignore. And so, you know, these are all things, as we talk about data collection in a few moments, these are all things that you'll want to make sure that you're listening and hearing from your students and your families and your communities, what's top of mind for them, to make sure that what you're planning and putting in place is going to meet their actual needs and concerns, right? So getting a sense of what are those kind of top concerns and how can we be proactive in meeting them. So that's why we're talking about data collection today. I probably don't have to go in too much depth with this, but for those of you, let's say maybe you're working with colleagues or other groups who maybe don't have school mental health kind of central in the back to school planning right now. I always like to include a few slides that you can have and use at your disposal as you're communicating to others about the importance of keeping mental health very central in our back to school planning. Thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic as well as other instances of racial violence in our communities as a trauma that our entire society is really going through is going to help ground us in what to expect. We know that traumatic events, whether they are wide scale, whether they're natural disasters or school violence, or whether they're individually experienced in someone's lifetime, has major impacts on school success, attendance, behavior difficulties in school, and academic performance. And the research is very strong in that area. The other thing that we know is that sometimes there are classroom behaviors that we see that we're not always alerted to, that they could be related to trauma, right? So if we see a student with difficulty paying attention or concentrating in class, yes, that absolutely could be a result of an attention deficit issue or ADHD, but it also could be related to trauma, because when you're going through a huge amount of stressors at home, outside of school, that really gets in the way of you being able to attend to the academic material and really be present and pay attention to what the teacher is saying and really encode that information. And the same goes with the rest of everything else on this list. So this is a list of sort of classroom behaviors or barriers to learning that we don't always immediately associate with trauma, but absolutely are examples of how trauma can play out in the classroom behavior that we see. So as you continue working with teachers, educators, other school staff, it's important to kind of broaden their scope about how trauma can look and play out in, you know, students' classroom or virtual classroom performance and things that we see. We know that social support and relationships are huge protective factors in helping children and adults become resilient, even when there's been a traumatic experience. So making sure that we are really building in a strong social support and relationship fabric in our school communities, and maintaining that is going to be one of the most protective things that we can do during this time. And being responsive to child needs and kind of checking in with them about emotions and supporting their emotion coping and their social skills, that's going to be helpful for all students, whether or not their degree of trauma is high or low. So responsive teacher support strategies are evidence-based regardless of what the cause is for supporting some of these.
Hey, Elizabeth.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. This is the other interpreter, Sarah. The interpreters are ready to switch.
Great, thank you. I'll wait until you're ready. Good, excellent. So some of you may be familiar with this concept of survival mode or survival brain that happens when an individual has been experienced to potentially traumatic experiences. And what happens is after we have gone through a traumatic experience and the emotional side, the bottom side of our brain is turned on so high, our body continues to be in high alert for other stressors. And so even if our learning brain and thinking brain, which is actually the part of the frontal lobe in the very front, is trying to turn on and learn, if we're experiencing stress, that survival brain is going to take over really quick. And so if this is a concept that you think would be useful to share with some of your colleagues, I highly recommend this very quick YouTube video. It's non-technical, it's designed for teachers, and I think it just gives a real clear picture of what we can anticipate when some of our students are returning back to school, and how, just the importance of supporting emotional regulation, behavioral coping when they're coming back to school. Because if that survival brain is continuing to turn on and we're not addressing that, we can't really expect kids to be in learning brain mode. Okay. So as you all mentioned, there is a wide variety of concerns that students, parents, and teachers are going to be coming back to school with. And so what I encourage you to do is think about how you can assess locally, right? So we understand these things globally. We understand the impact of trauma. You have a really clear sense of the variety of things that are on everybody's hearts and minds. But you want to pinpoint what are the kind of the highest priority things that we need to be paying close attention to. And you might learn some things that surprise you as well, which can just help you as you're kind of navigating this very complicated school year. It will help you kind of keep your hands on the wheel and make sure that you're turning in directions that are pinpointed to what the needs are for you locally. So I'm going to go over 4 data collection options that you may wish to consider. My goal is not for you to do all 4. My goal is for you to think about maybe there's one that you'd like to do this school year, or one in the near term and one in the longer term, okay? So taking this bit by bit. And I'm also going to ask, after I describe all 4, which of these you guys might be doing, because some of these might be underway in Wisconsin right now. So I'm going to talk about needs assessment surveys or listening activities, universal student mental health screening, teacher and staff stress and well-being assessments that we can do, and also assessing your comprehensive school mental health quality. Just have a couple slides on each. So I also want to mention that school climate surveys are another data collection option, and I'm happy to talk further about resources for school climate data, but I think it's personally sort of unclear how valid, reliable, or actionable those data would be in a distance learning context. Because who knows what school climate is in distance learning or hybrid learning. I don't think we have enough information about that right now. But these other 4 assessments can be applied for in-person, distance, or hybrid learning. So that's why I chose to focus on these 4. So the first one here is a needs assessment. This is just a collaborative process that a team would use to identify some gaps between kind of your current and desired conditions and some system strengths. So it helps you pick out what are the mental health needs that are most pressing for you locally, and how well your existing services and supports are actually meeting those needs. And then it can kind of help you set priorities. So this is something that is anonymous. And so it's not going to help you identify individual student or family needs, right? But this is really about kind of getting a bunch of folks anonymously to let you know how your services and supports are fitting their needs. So there's a couple different options. Traditionally, these have always been electronic or paper or pencil surveys that you might put together and pilot test before you send it out, and then send it out to a bunch of stakeholder groups. More recently, and this has been happening using activities that are more in real time, if that makes sense. So like focus groups, listening sessions, or town halls, where you may invite a group of students, or you may invite families or invite school staff to join you on Zoom and just talk through, just like we did now. And I asked you, what kind of needs do you anticipate coming back to school? This could be something that a school mental health provider could facilitate, or two of them could facilitate together, or a school leader and a mental health provider, but really just listening and hearing what are the main concerns on people's minds. Even if you're doing this qualitatively, as I would say, with like focus groups or Zoom calls, please make sure to pilot whatever your questions are or how you're going to go about it on a very small scale. Just call a couple friends who represent the stakeholder groups that you're inviting and ask them to give you feedback before you do it. You might learn some things and it'll help you tweak it before you start. So this slide is actually from the National School Mental Health Curriculum that's funded by SAMHSA for the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And I mention where it's from because if you haven't heard of the National School Mental Health Curriculum, I encourage you to look it up. And there's actually full modules on almost all of the topics that I'm talking about today. So if you want to know more about any of these and dive deeper, it's a great resource. But here's some needs assessment topics that you might consider. And so let me just give you an example of some of the questions that could be included in needs assessment. So maybe you would want to ask, what are the 2 greatest stressors faced by students? Or if you needed counseling related to stress or other concerns, where would you go for help? Would you recommend the available mental health services to another student? What actions would you recommend to improve current services and supports? So this is something that if you wanted to do as a survey, if you have access to like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics through your district, you could do it that way, or you could just get some folks on the phone. So you want to make sure that you're able to process the data that comes in. So if you do a survey and you have a lot of write-ins, just make sure that somebody is designated to be managing those data when they come in. So when you do a needs assessment, whether it's small and rapid or whether it's kind of multi-stage and it's something you want to do over the course of the year, what it gives you is really valuable information from people who are in your school community about what they need. Imagine if your students were able to write a letter to your school leaders for everything that they would recommend right now for reopening. How valuable would that be to your planning? And so again, from the Young Minds survey, there's a list of recommendations from young people, which I have here on the slide. And this is exactly the kind of information that you could get from a needs assessment. It actually spans all tiers of services and supports. I think a lot of it's tier 1 and tier 2 stuff. Everything from having a range of ways to check in with students to ask them how they feel, to implementing a gradual return, and they gave some specific ideas about that. Providing information about school reopening before it happens, what's it's going to look like. I mean, that's a really hard one because everybody is working right now on plans that are in flux. But I think as soon as the ink dries on that, let's get it out to students and families so we can start preparing them for what to expect coming back and manage some of that anxiety and uncertainty as soon as we're able. So there's a variety of good recommendations here. But again, I encourage you to kind of do this in your local community so that you have a sense of what the needs and recommendations are. So the second data collection that you might consider is individual student mental health screening. In talking with a number of schools and districts since the pandemic started, I think this is where people's minds go first, is there's going to be so much trauma. There's going to be so much anxiety. We need to screen for this coming in, right? And what I would say is, I would recommend that you enter into that sort of a process gradually and cautiously, because the likelihood is, as we reviewed in the beginning of the talk, the vast majority of people coming back to school are going to have a lot of distress and concern, right? So student mental health screening is an excellent thing to do because it really helps identify individual students and families who could benefit from tier 2 and 3 services and supports. But you want to do that as a gradual process. And if it's not something that your school or district has a well-developed plan for, you're probably not even going to be able, first of all, to logistically screen everybody. And second of all, respond to all of those needs. So this may not be kind of a whole school approach for you for reopening, but it's definitely an important data collection process that I encourage you to think about, especially if you're concerned, for example, about inequities in how students are referred to mental health services, right? So mental health screening is something that really helps us detect those mental health needs that otherwise might go unnoticed. So this is what it sounds like. It's a systematic tool or process to see whether a student could potentially benefit from tier 2 or tier 3 services. It is not a diagnosis. It's something that would require follow-up supports and assessment to see if services are actually warranted. And just to kind of keep in mind that it's different than doing a standardized assessment with somebody already referred to services, right? And that's a great thing to do. Please keep collecting those data, but that's not the same thing as universal mental health screening. And again, here's my little disclaimer about making sure you start small. If this is a brand new thing you're taking on, start at a classroom or a grade level, really refine your data collection and follow-up procedures to minimize risk. This isn't something that you want to do quickly. There are some outstanding and very practical resources at this point about school mental health screening. So if this is something that you're really interested in working in or perfecting or scaling up, I encourage you to check out these resources. So we know that if the teachers are not well, if the school staff is not doing well, then it's going to be very hard to support the well-being of our students, right? So the third data collection activity that you might consider this year is assessing your teacher and staff stress and well-being, okay? So you could do this through a systematic process to gather information about wellness. It could also, give you information about general satisfaction with the school or district. And the reason that you do this is to actually inform strategies to support teacher well-being throughout the year. And we want to do this because we know that burnout is real and runs high, and we're also at the risk of higher turnover rates this year with teachers, more than any other year potentially. So we want to make sure that this is rolled out in a way that's not accountability oriented and not judgmental. You could, again, traditionally this has been done with a survey, electronic or paper or pencil, but we're seeing more and more real-time kind of in-the-moment data collection where you're just gathering a group of teachers on a conference call or a Zoom call and saying, how are you guys doing? What are the top things on your mind? How can we support your well-being this year? And they'll, often give a lot of recommendations and ideas. So just really starting the conversation in a systematic way can be part of your data collection effort. And there is just an information here about well-being and what that is. So I will say, in a school district that I work with in Florida, we recently did a really brief survey that we sent out to teachers asking about the SEL, social emotional learning skills that their students need, and also the social emotional learning skills that they need right now. And we also asked teachers to tell us what they're doing right now to support themselves and their emotional well-being. And that was a write-in comment, and we got so many awesome examples and ideas of things that they did last school year and things that they want to find a way to do this school year. And many of them, I don't even know if these principals or administrators knew, just little things like having lunch together, or taking a few minutes to drink your cup of coffee before the students come in and the bell rings. I mean, we saw strategies kind of all across the board. So again, just making sure that you're kind of keeping your ear to the ground to make sure that we are caring for the adults in the building. Here are some measures if you're interested in doing an actual survey. The last two measures, there's actually a focus on the ProQual and the PULIS stress inventory. There's a focus on helping the person who answers the survey reflect on their own level of stress and well-being, which can be really helpful actually, because understanding what's specifically stressful to you can really help you understand what supports are going to be most likely, or what things you need to kind of layer in. So you might consider doing something like this. The remainder of the, yes.
We've got a question in the chat.
Great.
Question is, should assessments be administered before the start of the school year in an effort to prepare to meet needs?
If you can, start now, but don't feel like once school starts, the window for that is closed. Does that make sense? So you can continuously improve and layer in things throughout the school year, and many school communities do that, right? But there is such a race right now to get all of these assessments done. I would say take it at a pace that you can. But ideally, if there's some things that you can do right now before the school year starts, I think you would very much well position yourself for welcoming everybody back. So maybe, for example, you want to do some of the informal listening sessions or town halls or things like that, maybe with a plan to do a survey once school starts, depending on your timing. Can you remind me, when are Wisconsin schools opening typically there in the state?
Those that will be opening for in-person or blended, it's usually the week of Labor Day.
Okay, great. So you all have a little bit of time. Some of my southern states that I work with, they're looking at an August 11th opening. So take a breather, I guess, in a way. But yes, I think if you can start talking to people and gathering feedback while you still have a few weeks left of the summer, I would highly encourage that. So the rest of the talk really is more about kind of supporting students in our MTSS. So before I move past this particular kind of data collection, I just wanted to put a plug in for actual staff well-being resources. One is your Mighty Compassion Resilience Toolkit on the right-hand side, developed right there in Wisconsin, which I share almost everywhere I go on this topic. It's fantastic. There's also an online set of 5 online modules called Support for Teachers Affected by Trauma, or STAT, and it was developed by a collaborative of researchers and practitioners connected to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So that's another one that I would encourage. Okay, so we talked about needs assessment, anonymous needs assessments. We talked about student mental health screening, which is individualized. We talked about assessing for teacher well-being. The fourth kind of data collection you might consider is really getting a pulse check on your whole school mental health system. So if you want to do a bit of a needs assessment on what you're offering in your entire multi-tiered system of support to help you narrow down and prioritize, the really top key areas, the SHAPE system would be the best place for you to go to. So if you haven't been there, you can check it out now. I just have a couple of slides on it. You can enter as an individual, school team, district team, or state team. And it basically helps users work together using kind of systematic assessments to map your school mental health services and supports, kind of assess the quality of what you're doing, and then it gives you reports and resources and guidance to kind of narrow it down to a couple areas that you want to move forward. This is just a screenshot of what the quality assessment looks like, which is the main kind of school mental health quality assessment. the boxes that you see on the bottom are different sections of the assessment. So you can go in and say, you know, we really just want to assess how we're doing on teaming with respect to school mental health. And you can just go in and take those 9 questions, see your report and the resources for teaming, and get going on that. Or you can go in and do all 7, or any variation therein. It's pretty modular. There's also a school mental health profile that you can do. So if you want to get, sometimes teams use this when they feel like they all need to kind of get on the same page about what's being offered, whether your system is large or small. Sometimes it's really helpful to just have structured conversations around who are our students served in data systems, what kind of staffing do we have in place, and what services and supports are we offering at each tier. So if you really want to take kind of more of a global look at what you offered maybe last year, for example, and help that inform what you need to build out this year, especially since you do have several weeks left before school opens, I would encourage you to check this one out. And this just shows you what the summary report and strategic planning guide looks like. And so with that, I just wanted to pause and see how are you planning to assess the mental health and stress needs of your schools and communities? Are any of these either ongoing, or maybe there's data collection that I didn't mention that you guys have been doing, or either things you're just interested in trying out this fall?
Elizabeth, this is Sarah again. Can we switch interpreters?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. Any data collection plans coming through the chat?
We've got one so far. I'll just go ahead and read them out again as they come in. Universal screeners in elementary and secondary. Universal screening using the BASC-3 and the BAS. Drafting surveys through Google Forms for staff, students, and families. Universal screener in 9th grade for depression and suicide. CBITs. Using compassion resilience for teachers. Universally screen 9th graders using Y-Screen based off the Columbia Teen Screen. District administration sent Google Form survey to staff regarding what one is looking forward to, anxious about, what can be done to support staff. Just established a mental health leadership team to do a needs assessment. Compassion resilience for teachers beginning this year. Focus groups with teachers and surveys. Universal screeners for students, the SABRs, and staff well-being, onward book study and compassion resilience.
It's exciting to hear about how many screening efforts are going on, and I can tell by some of the grade levels too that at times we pick critical transition grades to screen, you know, like 6th grade or 9th grade, which that makes sense, right? Because those are really critical kind of developmental periods, and those grade transitions can be an important time to make sure that we're catching those needs early. That's great.
Couple more. Panorama, ACT Tessera Elementary School. Surveys needs assessment to parents and mental health teams, running groups 2 weeks before school starts.
Great. That is awesome. So I guess the one thing that I would recommend, and I'm sure this is on the mind of everybody who is continuing some mental health screening in one way, shape, or form this year, is that you may see higher rates of students kind of at or above your cutoff that would screen them in for further assessment. And so just kind of being prepared for that and knowing that it would not necessarily mean that we're signing up all of those children for tier 2 and tier 3 services, right? But rather we might want to take some grade level or classroom wide approaches, you know, really bringing it back down into the tier 1 and tier 2 level. I know for, you know, a number of years when I worked in Baltimore, there were many times where I would get a really slew of referrals from one grade level or from one teacher. And instead of signing them all up for individual services, it made more sense to have a conversation with those grade level teachers and say, okay, what can we do to support this particular need for your students? And maybe it's a series of classroom presentations or looking to the SEL curricula that you have at your disposal or other trainings and kind of supporting implementation of what they have at tier 1 and tier 2 levels. So I think the screening is critically important, but I just wanted to put that out there because there may be more needs screening in than your tier 2 and tier 3 services and supports can manage from like a capacity standpoint. And I think given the broad scale of this pandemic and trauma and everything that's impacted everybody, we would expect that everybody is coming in with a whole lot of stress. So just thinking ahead about tier 1 and tier 2 supports for that.
So Elizabeth, this is Tim again. I actually have a question related to that, and then we've got another one in the chat. So related to doing a screener and sort of having your tier 2 traditional systems overwhelmed, do you have sort of a model or a ballpark or sort of a critical mass of when you get a certain percentage of students who screen high that you would look at, or how you would look at the data to determine, okay, we need to just do something universally versus tier 2? And then I've got another question in the chat.
Okay, yeah, so let me take that first one. So it depends on a lot of variables. The first thing you want to do is assess what your capacity is at the tier 3 level. So kind of at that individual, family, and sort of billable group level. And that may be conversations now with your community partners and your related services professionals to understand what is their kind of capacity for caseload, right? And so that'll give you a sense of what your capacity is. From there, if you anticipate the capacity is not going to be able to manage what's coming in, then there's a couple different directions that you can take. One is working to onboard additional community partners, right? And doing some resource mapping around that. Another is making sure that those providing tier 2 and tier 3 services are able to deliver care kind of in briefer sessions, for example, 20 minutes versus 60 minutes. And sometimes those of us who trained first in the community and then came to school second just need some support around the 20-minute session and being able to expand our capacity that way. And the third is, I would say that you can, I don't think there's a critical percentage, like, and you can expect that 1 in 5 kids that you screen is going to have what we consider clinical or diagnosable mental health condition. That's just national prevalence. So you should be prepared for at least 20% of your student body to be eligible for tier 2 and tier 3 services. So I guess from that vantage point, if you're going much above that, then to me that says we really need kind of a wide scale, tier 1, tier 2 support. Does that help?
Yes, it does, Nick. Kind of answers, I think, the question that was in there. Can you address resistance to surveying teachers and staff or families because the district will not be able to meet all needs? So I think, Diana, if that didn't answer your question, put it in the chat again.
Mm-hmm.
But there is another that came in as you were speaking. Would you wait for a certain time frame to screen people, students, such as after people are able to settle in and get back into routines?
Not necessarily. I think if people are struggling with substantial mental health needs, you would be able to detect that now. And again, if you're scaling up your screening, you're probably going to be doing some screening data collection throughout the school year anyway, but you want to make sure that you're getting information out to your whole school community, whether it's parents, students, teachers, about who to let know and how to access help if they're distressed, right? And that goes hand in hand with making sure that there's sort of mental health literacy training for all of the adults in the building, right? So that the signs and symptoms of mental health risk are more obvious or noticeable to our adults so they can pick up on those things as well. So I don't think that I would recommend waiting necessarily. I would say if you're ready to do any of these data collection processes, do it now. I think we've learned that this is such a dynamic process that the more information you have now, the more it's going to inform where we're headed. And I mean, while we're on this topic, I'm just going to put a really strong plug in for Tier 1, okay? So by bolstering these supports that you have in particularly social emotional learning and anything that is going to really strengthen the relationship and the sense of community in your schools, you know, make sure that we kind of are validating emotions and helping students develop those social, emotional, and behavioral competencies, that is going to reduce the level of need that you have for, you know, more intensive services. That's why we have the triangle, right? Because if we're really investing heavily in Tier 1, particularly in this case where everybody has been through an enormous stressor, we need to make sure that we're really able to sort of take care of everybody's emotions in the moment, because we all have them. Whether we sort of meet criteria for a diagnosis or not, I think is beside the point. This is a really kind of wide scale stressor that everybody has been through. So I think the most that you can kind of double down on your Tier 1 supports, whether that's finding new Tier 1 supports that are a good fit for you, or maybe, you know, blowing the dust off something that your district invested in that maybe just you think is great but never got implemented well. Maybe it's investing in kind of the implementation supports as you think about doing that virtual or hybrid or whatever. But really investing in kind of the Tier 1 supports is going to be critically important during this time.
Great.
Elizabeth, this is
I had a couple of people in the chat mention something along those lines. So we are now all caught up on questions.
Elizabeth, this is Beth from DPI, and I just have a question myself, because we've had a few presentations, and I think sometimes it sounds like people are hearing maybe information that doesn't always align, because, you know, I think there was a recommendation that behavioral assessment wait until students have been in classrooms for a little bit. And I do think that there can be some confusion, because often the social emotional mental health screeners also include behavioral aspects to the screeners. Do you see a difference in those? Or, you know, like, is one, you were talking about mental health screening prior, if you can, do you have a thought about the behavioral screening?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So are you saying like observational? If you could tell me a little bit more about what you mean by behavioral screening.
Well, so there are a number of these surveys that don't only look at social emotional functioning of kids, but also look at like externalizing behaviors and things like that. And I think that sometimes these tools will include both of them when your intent may be to be assessing only one of them at the time.
Right.
And, you know, assessing student behaviors prior to when they get back is going to be pretty difficult to do. It's going to need some time to see how students react to the environment.
Yeah, I think it's a really good distinction, Beth, so I appreciate it. I think, you know, in my response, I was responding probably primarily to the internalizing concern, so I appreciate you pointing that out. So, you know, there is a lot of concern about the level of anxiety that everybody's experiencing, particularly students. Also, if there may be some depression symptoms, and we know that suicidal ideation has been on the rise for the past several years in this country. The CDC has kind of well documented that. So we know that there's really undetected internalizing concerns. That's what I would say, let's not wait, because if a student is really distressed, they're probably going to be distressed now. In terms of how they're responding to the school environment and how they're presenting, and whether they're, you know, attending to the information in the classroom and things like that, I agree. You might want to give time for people to settle in, but in the meantime, I would make sure that your Tier 1 supports are strong, right? So instead of, you know, just focusing on the academics, you want to make sure that you're really balancing that with a lot of SEL and supporting students' adjustment back to the classroom. I think I was talking about this with another group, and they were asking about like how to prepare teachers to know what to expect. And, you know, we were talking about how whether regardless of what kind of this trauma or stressor that you've been through, it starts looking the same at some point in the classroom, and that teachers may need to expect that what they're used to seeing in the first month of that grade level they're teaching, particularly from some seasoned teachers. Let's say they've taught 4th grade for several years. They kind of know what a first month 4th grader looks like, and they sort of understand the range of that. But I think many of our students are going to be coming in looking a little bit more like they did socially, behaviorally, emotionally, academically when schools closed and distance learning started, right? So just kind of being prepared for that, usually, relying on teachers to really understand, relying on teachers to report on who's kind of falling outside of the bell curve of what they would expect to be typical for that time in the school year. Usually they have a very keen sense of that, but I think we're going to have to rely on their sense as well, because the likelihood is there's going to be a number of students who are having a hard time adjusting behaviorally. And so the question is, are there students who are really still outliers compared to their peers when school comes back?
Thank you for that response. I think that really helped clarify some things. And then another one that I know has been getting asked in multiple community of practice calls. It sounds like what you're recommending, Elizabeth, is that, especially around universal supports, that our focus really should be on these social, emotional, mental health universal supports, probably a priority as opposed to the academics.
Absolutely. Can I have a t-shirt that says that? Yes, that's what I'm recommending.
So just so you can all say you heard it here, because I know many of you are struggling with that in your districts.
It's hard. It's very hard. We are very concerned. Everybody is concerned about the academic delays that students all experience during closures. So I do not want to discount that, particularly in critical grades. Like when I think about our secondary schools and our high school juniors and seniors that are, getting ready for college applications. So I don't want to minimize the level of concern that we should have over academic progress. However, what we know is students are not going to be able to learn, and they're certainly not going to be able to catch up unless their emotional and mental health and well-being is cared for and supported, right? So going back to that video that I had about the learning brain and the survival brain, until we're really supporting that social, emotional, behavioral wellness of the student, we cannot expect them to catch up academically, right? That's kind of a basic need. If you think about sort of Maslow's basic needs, our emotional stability and coping has to be intact for us to then kind of take on higher order thinking and to be, creative and in a problem solving space, in a place where we can listen and encode information and really be at our best. And for many students, I know this is true for my student, having a connection with the teacher and with your class and with your peers is also really critical to be able to learn, right? So if you're kind of sitting in class, whether it's virtually or in person, and you're not feeling kind of connected to the people in that space, and maybe you're experiencing a little bit of stress yourself, whatever the teacher is instructing in terms of academics is not going to be something that you're going to be able to take in that moment. So that's absolutely what I'm recommending. And I've worked closely with a district that had long-term closures following a Category 5 hurricane in Bay District, Florida. And one of the things that they learned of the schools that did really well when schools finally reopened after the storm was that schools who really put the SEL first and said the academics may need to be secondary, at least temporarily, when we open schools, they were the ones that ended up seeing some of their annual yearly progress get better by the end of the year. And it really, I think, comes from a leadership standpoint to kind of filtrate that down so the teachers really believe you that, it's okay if the academics are going slower, or we may not be catching them right up by the time November comes. But if we're focusing on the social emotional learning, then that rate of learning is going to come faster. Does that help?
Indeed, it does.
Okay.
You're getting a lot of people who want to buy that shirt. Just saying.
Well, we should mass produce it in Wisconsin, maybe. But it's something that I think we need to continue to reiterate, right? And that's why I had kind of the link to the trauma and learning slides in the beginning, like continuing to explain and sort of justify and find materials that help people connect that information, whether it's short videos or whatever it is. I think we need to kind of continue to send that message so that it doesn't get lost. There's so much planning right now for the academics and even the logistics of opening schools. The example I heard is like, you know, everybody's back to school and taping arrows in the hallways of which direction to walk, right? And that keeps you very busy, but at the same time, there's all this social emotional behavioral health that we need to be keeping at the forefront as well. I'm loving all the questions. Keep them coming. I do have more slides and I'll go through them, but you guys have the slides too, so please feel free to interrupt me as we go through. So if we don't get through every last bit of the content, I think the discussion and questions is probably what's more valuable on a community of practice call like this, and I'm available to you after this call as well if you want to chat. So I wanted to share some information about how you might consider preparing your multi-tiered system of support for student resilience and success. This is extremely individualized to your locale, but based on what we can anticipate from, you know, sort of a high level of stressors that everyone's experienced, here are some things that you might want to keep in mind if you're not already. You're all familiar with the triangle. Whenever I use a term, an acronym like MTSS, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So your school system should look something like this from an academic standpoint and a mental health standpoint, where you have some things you're delivering for all students at kind of that tier 1. In the context of mental health, we are hoping to prevent additional mental health you know, needs. At tier 2, that's for some students who need just a little bit more. And I would say we can expect a lot of students to need a kind of tier 2 level of support. And then for a few students, hopefully we would support them using our tier 3 services. A few little reminders that I always include when I show a triangle like this is that our tiers refer to services, not students. So let's be cautious in our language that we're always person first. There are no tier 2 students or tier 3 students. Students need a variety of different levels of supports and services over time and in different subject areas. So we want to make sure that our tiers are always referring to the services and supports being provided. And also we want to ensure that services are matched to student needs over time based on current or recent progress data. So students will sort of move throughout these tiers as well, depending on their needs.
Elizabeth?
Yes.
This is the interpreters again. Can we switch?
Yes, please do.
Sorry, for whatever reason, I'm having trouble making the switch this time.
That's okay.
Huh. I don't know.
I see you, Sarah.
Yeah, I can't make Sarah. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Okay, that should work. Sorry.
Good? Yes, okay, great. So typically what people do after a needs assessment, by the way, is to do a resource mapping process. And this is really relevant to your whole triangle. And so basically this is an active process where you're actually identifying and sometimes even visually representing what you have by way of services and supports at these different tiers. Importantly, this should be a process that results in something that's disseminated. So it's actually going out to people in your school community and even parents and students potentially at the secondary level, because the goal is that it should be active and can be used for people to sort of identify what services and supports are available. So sometimes school districts will invest in something. Tier 1 level is kind of a good example. Sometimes there will be an investment in a program or practice, and all schools have access to it, but maybe only a portion of those schools got trained, but it's still a resource that's available, right? So in your resource mapping process, if you identified something like that, you would want to include it, and you would want to make sure that you're kind of disseminating that information so that people can access it. Same goes for a variety of different tier 2 and tier 3 services and supports. So there's a whole, in the SHAPE system, there's a resource library that you can go and look under different topics. So there's a lot of materials there under resource mapping, and there's also a whole curriculum on needs assessment and resource mapping. There's a pretty clear guide that kind of walks you through this. So this is something where you want to, if you want to kind of get your arms around, so to speak, the services and supports that you have and where you might be having some gaps, after you've collected some needs assessment data, this is a good use of your time. I'm going to talk first briefly about tiers 2 and 3 and then tier 1. So tiers 2 and 3. So remember that tier 2 isn't just groups. I think sometimes that's a common, I don't know, misnomer. These can be small group interventions for students identified with similar needs, but it also can be brief individualized interventions like problem solving or motivational interviewing can be something that's briefer. Mentoring, peer-to-peer supports, any low-intensity classroom-based support, so a daily report card or daily teacher check-ins or homeschool note systems, those are kind of all considered tier 2. And then tier 3 is what we typically think of where that's really individualized or group or family therapy for students who are already experiencing distress and functional impairment. So there's a number of sample plans now that are proliferating for school reopening, and just here is some that I've selected. The Maryland State Department of Education has a nice plan, as does Kentucky and many, many others. But here are a few that I pulled that I think are really pertinent to tier 2 and tier 3. The first one here is on holding faculty and staff meetings to provide information on signs and symptoms to observe in students and clear referral procedures. So more than ever, you want to make sure that the adults in your building are briefed with how your student mental health system works. So how do you identify that a student needs more help, and how do you connect with somebody at the school to follow up? This can be anything as formal as a psychological first aid training where you're paying for an 8-hour training. It can also be a mental health service professional in your school doing a PowerPoint and talking with the staff about signs and symptoms of mental health and giving them like some one-pager flowcharts about who do you call, right? But just making sure that you built in time, whether it's that first week, that staff is coming back, just making sure that they're really briefed about this. And I think also asking them along the way. I mean, I've certainly been involved in services, you know, halfway through the school year, well, I'll sort of ask a group of teachers, do you know who to contact in your school if you're worried about a student's mental health? And like 3 hands go up, you know, and that happens. And then, you know, the administrator's surprised and the mental health professionals are surprised, but you just want to make sure that that information is continually being provided and refreshed. Communicating counseling support services available to students and families is really important. I know that mobile crisis teams vary across the country. They may also vary across the state of Wisconsin. They're highly dependent on funding, but just thinking through what is your kind of crisis response effort and strategy for students who really are in a really higher level of emotional behavioral crisis. And then again, I touched on resource mapping, but doing that now, you know, doing some resource mapping now. So referral pathways, I won't spend a ton of time on this. I feel like Wisconsin is like a pretty awesome stronghold by the way of referral pathways. You can see that I even have your referral pathway guide at the bottom of the screen, but I would really recommend that you evaluate and prepare your referral pathways right now and use what you learned when schools closed about how those had to shift so quickly and everything went virtual. You probably learned a lot about what had to change to connect kids to services, and you probably also learned a lot about what didn't work in the virtual space. So rely on that wisdom of what you learned when everybody had to do it immediately when schools closed to kind of plan ahead for this year. So how are your pathways, your forms, your feedback loops going to operate? Even if you're opening in-person learning, I think we all know that there's a possibility that we could have to go to hybrid or could have to go to remote. And I know a lot of teams are kind of contingency planning for that possibility. So really thinking ahead about how can you kind of bulletproof your referral pathways now for all sort of potential circumstances. Again, just ensuring mental health team members are in close communication with one another. Hopefully mental health team meetings have been happening via Zoom if they were already happening in person and those things have gone virtual, but you might need to be really explicit about that. And again, just making sure that people in your school community know how to refer a student and who to do that to. This is a really detailed slide, but what I want you to take away from it is that you might consider writing out your referral pathway if you haven't done this yet as a team, because sometimes people walk around with this information in their head and it never gets put on paper or shared with others. These are two examples that are available in the SHAPE system that was developed at the National Center for School Mental Health. On the left is a direct access model, and on the right is a team process model. Basically, how they vary is the direct access model is when there's lots of communication among mental health team members, but basically anybody can take in a referral individually and follow up with the family, and then they're going to touch base with their team to make sure there's not a duplication of services. On the right, if you can identify a school mental health team lead to be the point person of referrals received, and you have a really team-driven approach, like sometimes this might work well in a district that has like high quality PBIS implementation, for example, like you have a strong team structure, you might want to take referrals right into a school mental health team and make decisions there as a group. Of course, you need plans to kind of address urgent referrals before the team meets. But it really becomes kind of a more team-based decision. There's probably tons more variations on referral pathways, but this is just to get you thinking about, as you're preparing ahead for your referral pathways this year, what you might want yours to look like. And this is just an example of something that you might do for the school building level so that all of your staff understand who are the mental health providers in the building, what days are they there, how do you contact them, who are the students they serve. I will say that this, although it's de-identified, this is an actual thing that was developed in a school that I supervised, and these 5 mental health professionals actually met for 4 or 5 times to come up with this grid on their own, because they needed to sort out their roles and responsibilities and disentangle some duplication and have clarity about triaging students. And once they got that sorted out, they were in a really strong place as a team to then message that to the people in their school building. I do want to note that school counselor is not listed on here, and that's only because we didn't have a school counselor in the building, and the same is true as a school nurse. So there may be other positions not listed in this example. So for those of you who don't have community partners, I strongly encourage you to go find some. Or I know there's a lot of complexities in Wisconsin that sometimes limit your ability to do so. So I think to whatever degree that you can move toward a community partnered school mental health model is really going to help you, particularly this year. Student mental health cannot rely and rest on the shoulders of schools alone. It's really a shared responsibility with community and with family. And so even if you have community partners that you're working with now, it may be time to have conversations around sort of to what extent they meet the needs of your students, whether that be you know, insurances that they take or specialties that they have, to what extent they're providing evidence-based services. Can they help out with some tier 1 and tier 2 services in your school? And can they really work as a team with your school employed personnel? And think broadly, because I know that there, you know, sometimes we're in a real mental health shortage in terms of community mental health providers, but there may be other community-based organizations and services that meet kind of the social determinants of health that pose barriers to learning for your students. And you might want to connect them to other types of community groups to meet those needs. So let's say you have a shortage of community-based mental health providers. Maybe there's other things in your community that the school can help link students and families to, like housing authorities, food banks, faith-based organizations, peer-to-peer supports, etc. And in case anyone's kind of going back to their MOUs right now, here's an example on SHAPE that you can look at if you want to start, you know, kind of renegotiate them, you know, coming to team meetings or doing some tier 1 and tier 2 stuff. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to talk a minute about tier 1. I want to encourage you to think about action steps that you might take in kind of the tier 2, tier 3 realm this school year. And as you're doing that, you know, what kind of data collection options are going to help guide you in what you need to do. So this is just a list of Tier 1 services and supports that you may have. I know we've talked a bunch about kind of mental health literacy and social emotional learning. Those are the ones that I would strongly recommend investing in when you're coming back to school this year, but all of these things are critically important. And I don't think that any of us can do too much Tier 1 ever, and particularly this school year, as we know so many people are coming in with a lot. So as I'm talking through the next couple Tier 1 slides, I want to encourage you to type in the chat box any Tier 1 curricula, materials, or resources that you currently use and like, and that is for the benefit of one another. I think sometimes it's really helpful to hear from your peers what they're doing, you know, in other places in your state. So if there's something that you like and you're going to kind of double down on this school year, please type that into the chat so that people can see that, and you guys could even connect offline about that if you wish. So there's a number of things that you can do throughout the school year to support Tier 1. You know, this one, the first one here is pretty basic. It's just normalizing feelings through forums and spaces for compassionate listening. Again, this kind of goes back to the idea of the listening sessions or the town halls. You know, making sure that you're doing that throughout is really going to be relevant for everybody. And again, kind of a focus on the social emotional learning strategies. You know, one thing that I didn't mention around data collection that I do think is relevant for distance and hybrid learning is that oftentimes when we collect data from our school community and our school stakeholders, it really gives us an opportunity to strengthen the relationship with the community by providing feedback about what we heard and what we're planning to do next based on what we heard in the listening session or the survey or the focus group. So I encourage you, as you're collecting feedback and data from people throughout the school year, make sure that you're taking the time to do a one-pager or an email blast or a social media post or whatever it is to say, you know, here's 2 things that we heard in our listening session last week. Our school leaders are listening, and this is what we're paying attention to as a result, right? So whether we're in person or not, those data feedback loops kind of help strengthen our relationship with our communities because it shows that we're listening to their feedback and we've heard them. So teachers may be worried about what they can do, and we don't want them to feel overwhelmed by the needs, the social emotional needs of students coming back. So I think at Tier 1, one of the things that we can do throughout whatever programming you choose is really let teachers know that the positive relationships that they have with students in any way that they can build that is going to really help students cope and be resilient. And, you know, they don't have to be a mental health provider. They don't have to have specialized training in mental health, although you may wish to provide them with some mental health literacy supports or trainings. But this is simple stuff like checking in with students about how they're feeling, giving students opportunities to share experiences and to give and receive support, providing routine and structure to whatever extent you can. That helps us provide a sense of community and connection. And absolutely, we need our teachers to be taking care of themselves as well. The next couple slides are actually just the same information that I'm showing you in a couple different formats, because as you think about getting this kind of information out to teachers about their role, you might want to think about examples like these or even borrowing these. And it's the basics. It's the basic stuff that we want our school staff to know. So this was actually developed in Indiana by a school district that was getting a lot of questions from teachers during distance learning, that students were mentioning stressors during distance learning and teachers didn't know how to respond and they were feeling kind of ill-equipped. And so they put together this resource and it just gives 5 basic steps. And each of these links gives more kind of scripts and information. So it goes from connecting with students to listening and reflecting, providing reassurance, managing, helping manage kind of stress load and self-regulation, and then linking to additional support as needed. So for some of our school staff, that something like listening and reflecting and providing reassurance might be really natural to them. Maybe they have a high kind of natural skill set or specialized training in that area. For other staff, they might need more support. They might need a couple example, lines or scripts. And so as you send out this information to teachers about their role, we just want to be mindful that they're all coming from different comfort zones with this kind of stuff. Here's a really basic one that communicates the same information. It's from Kentucky DOE. They had a nice school reopening plan about social emotional, and it basically lays this plan out for monitoring for target supports. We need to kind of look and observe, act and listen, and link students to services who need more, right? So those are kind of the basics, making sure that we are observing, we're kind of checking in with students, we're getting a sense of what the needs are locally, we're really listening and reflecting, and then doing what we can for everybody, and then linking to students who need more. For those of you who have very trauma responsive or trauma sensitive emphasis in your locales, I want to highlight that this is all very consistent with a trauma sensitive approach to schooling. So this is a slide about what is a trauma sensitive educator from HHS, and it talks about the importance of just realizing the prevalence and impact of trauma, recognizing signs and symptoms and barriers to learning, and then doing something in response to sort of avoid re-traumatization, and also linking students who need more to those services. So although there's nuances certainly in a trauma-informed approach and some of the other things that I showed, which are a little bit more mental health literacy, psychological first aid, I hope you can see there's a lot of common threads and common messaging. And so it's kind of up for you all to figure out what language or your school's going to really respond to kind of get these basic messages out about their role. So just a couple take-home tips as we wrap up here in the next couple minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a couple minutes for questions left. So we know that the precautions related to COVID-19, such as school closures, have impacted students, families, and school staff in a lot of different ways. And so you want to make sure that you're assessing some needs locally to understand what is happening in your specific locale. There are some things that you can plan ahead for now, understanding COVID in the context of being a trauma, and knowing the impact that sort of economic downturns have on children, and knowing that access to care has been disrupted. So again, we kind of know these things globally from the research base, but you still want to assess what is happening in real time locally for you to make sure that you're really prioritizing top areas. All students are going to need some social emotional support to be ready to learn. So start printing your t-shirts now. And with respect to tier 2 and tier 3 services, it will likely overwhelm your system to sign up every student who has more than typical levels of distress right now into an individualized service or support. So really thinking about investing in tier 1 supports for all students is going to be critical. Getting your referral pathways organized now and identifying those community partners now. I'm hopeful that some of the slides and the materials that I showed you today look familiar, sound familiar, they feel like the school mental health that you're used to, or maybe some of the goals that you have for this school year are still areas that you've been trying to work on it for a while. And there's a reason for that, right? We know what high quality school mental health is. We know what we need to do. We understand the triangle. And although the COVID pandemic is certainly an unprecedented scenario, there's a lot that we can rely on in terms of our own expertise, the resources at our disposal, and high quality school mental health has not changed, right? So this situation hasn't changed the relationships that we have with our students, the importance of our school communities staying strong and doing what we need to do for high quality school mental health. So, you guys, you have this. There's a lot that we know, and it's just a matter, I think, of making sure that we're assessing some local needs and understanding in real time, some of these nuances to make sure that we can be very pinpointed in our planning. In closing, this is a nice quote. that I pulled from that report that I love of young people who shared a lot when closings first happened. And this person said, no matter what happens, we can survive this. It may not seem so now, but I promise you it will be okay. Talk to someone if you feel you need to. There is no shame in asking for help, especially during a crisis. And so if our young people can have this type of wisdom, I encourage us to internalize that as well, and to kind of send this message of sort of validating and supporting our students, you know, and our school communities in the same way that we do every year. So with that, my contact information is here. I have some additional resources if you really want to dive in, but I'll stop screen sharing so I can see the chat, and I think we have just a few minutes here for questions. I love Beth's wisdom. Keep calm and Maslow on. That's wonderful. Are there questions that I didn't get to? Go ahead.
Yeah, please feel free to put questions in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask.
And while you're doing that, because I didn't have my chat, usually I chat you guys a lot of resources during my presentation. When I'm screen sharing, it's hard. There's a great resource that just came out from Kaiser Permanente, which is called like a playbook for the next normal at school. And it has kind of starter plays and just things to be thinking about with respect to school mental health for reopening. It has a lot of the same themes that we just talked about, and it's really accessible. It's like 5 pages, and it's developed like a checklist. So if there's planning going on in your schools right now, this could be a good one to share with people. Thanks for your positive comment, Rita. It's always an honor to speak with Wisconsin. I wish I could be with you guys in person. Elizabeth Freeman asked about referral pathways and if I have an electronic tool that I prefer for internal referrals. Okay, so if some of you have heard me speak before, you know that I come from a fairly old school / rudimentary operations of school mental health where we didn't even have electronic health records. I think they just do now. I would say that for internal referrals, usually we would do that via email. I think if you're able to have secure email with your providers, that is really helpful. You could also have a Google Sheet if your school supports that and being confidential. But I'm wondering, does anybody else on the line have a good process for internal referrals that would be electronic?
As folks are thinking about that, Dr. Connors, there was a question or a comment that this seems really overwhelming for somebody who's new to a district. What kind of advice would you give somebody who might have transitioned to a new district and they're unfamiliar with maybe what that landscape is, or they're a new hire coming straight out of a preparation program? What would you say to them?
Perfect question. I would say school mental health is a team sport and you can't do anything on your own. So your number one job is to get to know your team and listen and get to know the system and start to understand their priorities. Even if you've been hired in a leadership role or a team lead role, the first thing you can do is really just understand that system, because before you can make change or make recommendations, I think you really have to kind of immerse yourself there. And I would just take it a piece at a time. And learn, just ask people what their priorities are. school mental health is very overwhelming, even for people who've been in this job a long time, because there's always something else to do, and there's always some gap that we need to fill, and there's always some capacity we don't have. So I think the other thing I would say is it just comes with the territory, and you probably know a lot about school mental health already if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, because the more you learn, the more that you know that you've got room to grow, right? So it's always about the connections and the relationships with your team, making sure you're doing things as a team, and you have to kind of prioritize your quality improvement goals. You can't take it all on in a school year. You've got to figure out, you know, what things do we want to pinpoint for this school year to take on.
I'd also like, I would also like to throw out that you have a community of practice here. And if you are looking for somebody to talk to more personally about how they're managing things or get some ideas, you can reach out to any of the DPI mental health team and we'll help connect you to somebody. So you do have the opportunity to connect with others as well.
Then Diana asked you to repeat the Kaiser Permanente resource that you'd mentioned.
Yep. So it's a Kaiser Permanente resource, planning for the next normal at school. And I put, there's two links. One is the landing page for it, and then the other one is the actual 5-page PDF. But it's Kaiser Permanente Thriving Schools. And the resource is called Planning for the Next Normal at School, keeping students, staff, and families safe and healthy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Connors. It looks like we're at our 10:30 mark, so we will sign off.
Thank you all so much for participating, and I wish you all the best in this school year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Connors.
We always appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Beth, we'll see everybody in a couple of weeks, correct?
Yes, 2 weeks, our next session. We sent information out about that. And so we provided you with the information for the 2 that are coming up in August. Please note that there will be ASL interpreters for those as well.
Terrific. Thanks, everybody. Keep calm and Maslow on.
Bye.